Okay, we are on week number 14. Yes, week number 14 of domestic relations. We're going to cover domestic violence and restraining orders and protection orders and go over some of the language that you need to know. Your book doesn't have a ton in it about this, so a lot of this will just be my lecture, which is pretty typical. So, domestic violence. We're kind of crossing domestic relations law, family law, and criminal law. Yeah, that's a lot. I always tell you, you cannot look at the law in a vacuum. It's not like I just do domestic relations law, so that's all I know. Can't do that. You have to know real estate law. You have to know wills, trust, and estate law. You have to know criminal law. You have to know bankruptcy law in order to do a good job doing domestic relations law. So that's why we're going over this. Now, lots of times, sadly, we have situations where marriages go way off the rails. You know, people aren't just fighting about what color of couch they want to have or whose house they're going to for Thanksgiving. A lot of times, violence, abuse is involved in marriages, just like in any kind of relationship. It's just magnified because these are two people who are presumably together a lot of the time. And you get to see people in their most intimate personalities, all the warts, everything. Sometimes domestic violence comes from addiction issues, gambling, alcohol, drugs. A lot of times anger issues, a lot of the time power issues. There are so many reasons why we get people who are violent with one another. Now, understand that domestic violence is not just for people, the crime of domestic violence is not just for people who are married. If you are cohabitating with someone and you have a child, domestic violence laws apply to you also. So why am I spending any time on this? Well, because sometimes this is the reason for the divorce, and you better know about that. I had a case once where I had a guy who worked at General Motors when Lordstown, was making cars. And I represented his wife. And he beat the crap out of his wife. And all she wanted to do was get away. She didn't care. She didn't care if she got half of his pension, half of his deferred compensation. She didn't care if she got half the house or a car. She didn't care. And so, sadly, those are cases that come up. And just a little sidebar. If you know that the client, your client's soon-to-be ex-spouse, is that violent, you have to take protective measures too. This particular case, I never will forget it, the guy actually threatened me. I had to go to the police and get a restraining order against him. It was awful. So you have to remember that if they're willing to abuse their spouse, and if they think they're going to lose half of their fortune, they're going to blame you in your office. So you have to keep that in mind. So what exactly is domestic violence? Well, it is where someone feels that they are in imminent risk of bodily harm, or they already have suffered bodily harm. Okay? So if my spouse every night is saying, don't go to sleep, you might not wake up, That's domestic violence. If my spouse is in the kitchen with a knife pointed at me but doesn't hurt me, that's still domestic violence. If my spouse uses force in touching me, that's domestic violence. Okay? Now, we could get into, can married couples be raped and all. We're not going to get into that. That's for criminal law. Okay? But those are the biggies, where the threats are debilitating, or the where there's actual force that's used against a spouse. Now, stalking is another crime that we end up dealing with a lot in domestic domestic relations court, where couples are separated and one spouse or soon-to-be ex-spouse or ex-spouse really follows, stalks. I know you went on a date yesterday. Who's that guy who's talking to you in the grocery store? You know, who's that woman that you went out with last night? Okay, those are separate issues. Those aren't domestic violence issues, but they are criminal cases that are related to domestic violence. So you have to be aware of this with your clients. You know, if your client says to you, you know, I'm afraid of her, I'm afraid of him. Okay? You have to be aware of that. And by the way, I'm just going to throw this out there. In homosexual marriages, statistics are now that domestic violence is rising. So don't think that just because you have a termination of a same-sex marriage, excuse me, you don't have to explore these same issues. They're there. This is more like human characteristics. And some people just are people who want to assert themselves through force. And there are just, whether they're married or not, there are people who are addicted to whatever substance or behavior and will react violently. Okay? So what do we do with this? What do we do with domestic violence? Well, if a client comes to your office and says, hey, you know, there's violence in my home. I'm afraid for me. If I have children, I'm afraid for my children. There are a couple of things that you can do. The first thing is you have your client call the police and press criminal charges. The second thing you can do while that's all pending is go the civil route and get what's called a civil protection order, or a CPO. Okay, a CPO is something that domestic relations or family court does. So you'll send your client. You generally don't go with your client. You generally will send your client to the court. You will tell them that you want to file for a civil protection order. There may be an advocate there. There are most counties have victims assistants or people who work with battered women's shelters who will assist your client with filling out the paperwork for the civil protection order and then going before a magistrate, usually a magistrate judge, not the judge him or herself, but a magistrate judge, and present what's going on. Okay? So what's the difference? What's the difference between a civil protection order and then going the criminal route? Civil protection order usually is given like that. It's done on the spot, and it has the same effect as a criminal restraining order, which is part of what you're going to get in the criminal process. But it's going to take a day or two to get a restraining order. With a civil protection order, it's instantaneous. Now, what is a civil protection order? Well, it is the domestic relations court's version of a restraining order, saying that whoever your client is accusing, their spouse or their partner, if they're not married, keeping them from having contact with you and your children. which is really kind of where we get into the sticky stuff. If they are cohabitating, they got to get their stuff out of the house. They're not allowed back in that house, or apartment, or wherever, trailer, wherever you're staying. They're not allowed back in there. Again, this is where we get to lots of problems. I can't get my coat. I can't get my shoes. I can't get my clothes for work. You know, the police will get involved and will help you get his stuff or her stuff out of the house, on the porch, in the hallway, wherever, and the police can then kind of supervise and make sure that there's no contact. Okay? CPO preliminarily is only good for 14 days. Why is that? Well, because when you get a CPO, what you're doing is you're going through what's called an ex parte proceeding. Ex parte, Latin phrase of the day, away from is what it means. Away from the party. So you're there, they don't have an opportunity, the person you're accusing doesn't have an opportunity to say, what are you talking about? I never do anything like that. Okay? So it's only good for a very short period of time, at which time there will be a full-blown hearing on it. So when your client goes into family court, domestic relations court, and says, I need a CPO, it may be granted right away, but it's not lasting forever. What will happen is the magistrate will grant the CPO and then say, okay, we have a hearing set for, and it'll be within 2 weeks. At that point in time, your office will then go with your client to this hearing. At which time the magistrate will hear both sides of the story and will decide whether to make this CPO permanent. And when I say permanent, it's permanent for 2 years. Okay? Or longer. I mean, you can make it, the magistrate can make it longer. It's not a forever thing. You're going to have to come back again, but it's for a long stretch of time. Okay? Lots of times, what will happen is the lawyer for, the spouse that filed for the CPO, which is you, and the lawyer for the other soon-to-be ex-spouse will get together and do what's called an agreed, uncontested CPO. What that means is, I won't call you, I won't come near you, I want to see my kids, so we have to make arrangements. There'll be some kind of visitation schedule that's built into the CPO. And if we go to our kids' events, we have to be 1,000 feet apart. You can't come near me. Okay? This is hard. This is really hard. But it's much easier to get an agreement so that, especially when there are children, you can make arrangements. Okay? For visitation. So if there's no agreement, then you have a hearing and your client will be questioned. The soon-to-be ex-spouse or partner will be questioned and the judge will make a decision. Like with divorces and everything, you don't want a stranger in a robe to say how you're going to live your life. You're letting somebody else into your life. So it's much better to come to some kind of an agreement. Okay, so the parties get together, the lawyers for the parties get together, they have an agreement most of the time. If there's no agreement, there's a hearing. When there are children involved, you basically set up either a sole custody or a modified visitation schedule, standard visitation schedule. Excuse me. Depends on how old the children are. Depends on school, extracurriculars, where everybody's going to be living. A lot depends on that. Typically, if you come to an agreement, that says, you honk the horn, the kids come out, you don't come near the house. You park on the street, you honk the horn, or you call on your cell phone and the kids come out. No contact. If you can't do that, you're going to use a safe house. Safe houses are in every county where they facilitate the exchange of children. So let's say dad has a CPO against him. Mom will take the children to the safe house, drop them off, leave. Within 15 minutes, dad will come pick them up. When visitation is over, he will leave them there and mom will come pick them up. It costs money to do that, by the way. These safe houses are not free. You have to pay fees. And if you don't pay your fees, then you generally don't get visitation with your kids. So usually dropping off at the end of the driveway is the better way to do it. It's a lot less expensive. It's a lot less traumatic on the children. And it generally works. I've had many cases where it doesn't work. I've had many cases where one spouse will be sitting at the end of the driveway, honking the horn, swearing, throwing garbage on the driveway. I'd like to say that's uncommon, but it's fairly common, right? Great for the kids, right? It's really great for the kids to see mom and dad acting like idiots, but there we have it. And then you have no choice but to use the safe house. Okay? So that's how a CPO works. Now, in the context of a divorce, if we're doing this at the beginning of the divorce, quite frankly, we're resolving a lot of issues like that. I don't have to go to a court to get a preliminary or a hearing on setting who's going to pay bills or who's going to do visitation. I don't have to do all of that. I don't have to say who's going to live where. This CPO is going to cover a lot of it. Who's going to live where? Done. What our temporary visitation schedule is? Done. It's in the CPO. Generally, that's what's going to be in place when the divorce is over. Now, you could say to yourself, boy, that might be a really easy way to get things resolved quickly. And a lot of lawyers do. And a lot of lawyers will advise their clients, if there's anything close to a CPO, a text that was angry, or, I'm going to kill you, I can't believe you're doing this. Some lawyers will abuse the process, send their client down to get a CPO. They'll be successful because the court does not want to be in a situation where next week someone in their courtroom is dead because they didn't believe them and didn't grant them a CPO. So lots of CPOs get granted, at least the preliminary ones for the 14 days. Okay? So a lot of lawyers abuse this. I off the top of my head can think of 4 who, if you know that your client's spouse is represented by them, you better be prepared for a CPO. It's coming. Some of them you fight, some of them you say, that's all right, let's just get this thing done. But understand that this is something that's abused. Now, CPOs where people are not married can similarly be abused. Mom and dad are living together, 1 or 2 children in the household. Mom is done with the relationship, but doesn't want to tell dad. Goes and gets a CPO. And then we have you can't be within so many feet, but we get a visitation package in place as part of a permanent CPO, which stinks. It really stinks. You see them, quite frankly, far less often with people who are not married, unless it is something pretty significant. Because typically, with those cases, the police come and there's a domestic violence that's charged. Done. They generally won't go for a CPO. Generally, it is the people who are going through a divorce who will use the CPO. But that doesn't mean that people who aren't married can't use it. They can. Okay? Now, can you use a CPO against your mother-in-law? Nope. CPO is the civil version of a restraining order in criminal court. What happens if you violate the CPO? You're going to jail. Basically has the same effect as a restraining order. Okay? You'll be in contempt of the order. And remember that contempt means, you really don't give a hoot about what we say here at the court. You're contemptuous of us. Therefore, we're going to find you in contempt, and we have several things we can do to you. So if you violate the CPO, you're in trouble. What happens if you get in a situation where mom says, he hit me, dad says, well, she hit me first? You can get cross petitions, you can get cross CPOs, you can get all of that going with CPOs, and the magistrate will sort it out. And generally, those are the easy ones, where you say, clearly neither of you can get along with each other. We're going to do CPOs for both of you. Stay away from each other. Okay? Also, if your client has been battered, and by the way, some courts will call the spouse that is doing physical harm to the other spouse the batterer, right? You've heard of battered women's shelters. So the batterer is the person who is battering the other person, battering, hitting, right? Assault and battering. I don't know if you remember that from criminal law. If there has been significant, like they've been hospitalized, every state has a compensation program for victims of crime. And you can encourage and help your client to get assistance through the state victims compensation program, victims compensation program. Okay? So that's another facet of this whole process. Now, let's switch over to the criminal side. So let's say the police are called and they say there's domestic violence. Typically, in most jurisdictions, unless it's really clear that one was doing it to the other, both are going to be arrested. Both. And then the court will sort it out. At the end of it, if the court finds that there has been a crime committed, then the court will issue restraining orders. There can be cross restraining orders, just like with CPOs. And what happens if you violate the restraining order? You go to jail. Okay? Now, if that happens outside of what you're doing with your client, you really don't have to do anything. The court takes care of all of that, except with respect to children, where you will have to go to the domestic relations court or juvenile court and either modify an existing visitation order, or if one hasn't been put in place, put one in place so that you can meet the parameters of whatever, the CPO or the restraining order. Okay? It is a really big part of domestic relations law, sadly. It just is. And you have to be aware of it, because in an instant, a client will call and say, what do I do? He's breaking in the window. What do I do? And you have to have an answer. Or he's threatening to kill me. What do you do? Now you know. Okay? So even though there's not a ton in your book, that's some real life stuff. Okay? If you have any questions, please reach out to me. And please do your discussion and your assignments. Thank you.